to this second session on our review of CRS216. In the previous session, we have actually focused on nouns, and in this section, we will start our focus on the verbs. Now, because the verbs are so many, we will be breaking this session into two, and we will start with the indicative verbs. And in fact, we will be looking at almost every aspect of verb under the indicative mood, beginning from the present and active indicative verbs to the passive, to the middle, to the imperfect, and even to the future aorist. But we will need to break it into two, and this we will do very soon. I am Olubi Adewale, your facilitator for this session, and I welcome you into this session on Greek verbs. Let's go on. Yeah, you are welcome to this second part of Greek verbs. And welcome to this second. We have said earlier, the intended learning outcome remains the same. Concession. And this second part of verbs begin actually with the future active and the future middle indicative verbs. Now, the first thing you need to know that the future stem of the verb is obtained by adding sigma to the verb stem. You remember that if you are using luo as an example, lu is your stem, and then you add sigma and it becomes loose. Then you now begin to add your primary tense, the tense endings. So, on our review, future active form of luo will become luso, lusais, lusai, lusomen, lusete, lusosi. So if you look at this and you look at the present active indicative, you discover that the difference is the presence of sigma between the stem and the ending. Now, in the middle form, the future middle, you now have lusomai, luse, lusetai, lusometha, luseste, and lusontai. CRS216. Now, there are some changes that will take place in the future tense because of the presence of the sigma. Now, there are certain letters, when they come into play with sigma, that will provide some changes. Some of the examples. Verbs that end in liquid consonants. Now, in this class of words, the sigma that is added to the stem will be dropped, and then the omega will carry the accent. So, for example, when you look at menso, instead of it to have menso, because of no, that's a liquid consonant, you will have meno, but your accent will now go to the omega as a circumflex. Apostello becomes apostello with the omega carrying the accent. Now, in the case of mute consonants, palatal consonants are kappa, gamma, chi. They become xi before sigma. So what's like ago becomes axo. Labial consonants like pi, beta, phi, they will become ps before sigma. So what's like blepo becomes blepso. Dental consonants, tau, delta, theta, will drop out before sigma. Therefore, pytho will become paiso. The theta drops out and the sigma comes in. And in the case of sibilants, like sigma, z, they also behave like dentals. And for example, sozo will become so-so. Now, there are other future stems that are entirely different from these ones, and these include ginosko, because the stem of ginosko is gno, G-N-O, gno. The future stem will now be gnos. In the case of keruzo, the stem is keruk, and because of the presence of sigma and this k, it will now become kerux. Now, these differences account for the variety of differences between future stem forms. However, once your first person singular of the feature is land, it is easy for you to just put in the remaining forms. It is important to know that some verbs are active in the present, but when they come to the future tense, they become deponent. Examples include lambano, which has its feature in the deponent as lempsomai. Ginosko is also deponent and it becomes gnosomai. So please, like I've always advised, all these variant tenses, vocabularies should be learnt as vocabularies on their own right. In the previous session, now we are going to look at the time and the kind of action in the future tense. Definitely the time of action is future, and the kind of action can also be punctiliar or linear. The context will always tell you which one is intended. But you should also know that most of the time it is punctiliar because the periphrastic feature is usually used for the continuous action. So the following are the functions of the future tense. It can function as the simple predictive tense, in other words, that tell us what will happen. Then it can also be used as an imperative. And we are taking this example from the gospel, Kalisaisto Odoma Autu Yonin, which means you shall call his name John. It's an imperative. And then you have the deliberative future, which is usually used to form a rhetorical question. The example here is Kurie prostina apelusumetha, that is, Lord, to whom shall we go? We have actually. Now, remember, aini is our verb to be, and it also wants its own future tense. So, aini in the future becomes esomai, I shall be, then ese, you will be, estai, he will be, esometha, we shall be, eseste, you will be, esontai, they will be. Get ready for a brief focus on. Choose 10 verbs, write them in the future active and the future middle. Just pick any 10 verbs of your choice and write them out. Write out the future active form and write out the future middle form. If you have any questions, you can ask at the next synchronous class. Now we are going to the aorist. In Greek, as in English language, there are two ways of forming the past tense. The two ways of forming the past tense in Greek are called the first aorist and the second aorist. Now, the Greek verb that add sigma to their stem are the first aorist, and the others that add the endings without the sigma are the second aorist. Now, I know some of you will now begin to ask, if sigma then shows us the future tense, how are we going to demarcate between sigma of the future and sigma of the aorist? The difference is simple. Because aorist is a secondary tense, it carries the augment. And remember, there are two types of augment, the syllabic augment and the temporal augment. So where you see an augment and you see sigma, you should know that you are in the first aorist verb. nouns. Now, the kind of action in the aorist is also the different because kind of action in the aorist is always usually punctiliar. The Greek aorist corresponds to the simple past tense of the English and the perfect tense of the English language. Now, aorist can be used the following ways. It can be used constitutively, and in this usage, the action is looked up in its entirety. The action will be taken as a single action. A very good example is ebaptiste tu anthropou, which will be translated as he baptized the men. Now, definitely baptizing men, that is plural, will definitely take some time, but in this sentence, it is looked at as a single action. Now, and in this, we also have the ingressive aorist, when the aorist view the act as having occurred, but emphasizes the initiation, that is the beginning, the commencement of that action. Example here is Diomas eptokwese, which will be translated, for your sakes he became poor. So the emphasis is on the becoming. The becoming. Now, the next one is the combinative aorist, and combinative aorist views the action as having occurred, but emphasizes the end of the action, not like the beginning, like ingressive, and also a state of being that results from that action. Now, a good example here is taken from the book of Acts. Tom proton logon epoesamen, the former treatise I have made. In other words, the former treatise is existing on its own. It's already a state of existence. Section will start. Now, first aorist indicative, active indicative of luo would be elusa, elusas, elusen, elusamen, elusate, and elusanto. That's our focus. The middle will be elusamen, eluso, elusanto, elusametha, elusaste, elusanto. Look at where these words are duplicated so that when you come across them, you will allow the context to take on the verb is to be used. Now, the second aorist, like we have said, does not use sigma. In fact, most of the time, they appear differently. So, the only way that one can tell you the ending is usually the augment and then the on ends. The function of the first and second are similar. Their difference is only in their writing. Now, the verb I done is from the verb ida, though some grammarians will say it's a second aorist form of blepo. The second aorist ipon is from the verb femi, though some grammarians will also classify it as a second aorist form of lego. Now, idon and ipon in the New Testament usually has first aorist endings on the second aorist stem. So take note of that. There are some verbs that are deponent in the present, but they become active in the aorist. An example is erkomai, but the aorist is erthon. So you need to be checking the lexicon so that you will determine what aorist form. Now, because the verbs are. Now, let's look at the second aorist. This time we cannot use luo, so we are going to use lipo. So it becomes elipon, elipes, elipe or elipen, then elipomen, elipete, and elipon. Take note, you have to study so many, like we have said before. In the middle, it becomes elipomen, elipu, elipeto, elipometa, elipeste, and eliponto. Now, the first aorist passive. The first aorist passive has a tense suffix in which the syllable the, but in the indicative, it appears at the. Now, note that the secondary active endings are used, and then there are going to be some changes because of the presence of this consonant. Breaking this session. Take a look at the changes now. In the liquid consonants, no will drop out before theta, so crino will become ecrithen. Lambda, rho are retained before theta, so angelo becomes egelthane. Mu, insert eta before theta, so meno becomes emenethen. Now please just study all these variations and read them like vocabularies on their own so that you get used to two. Now the second aorist passive is like the first aorist passive except for the absence of theta. The aorist passive of a verb cannot be determined by the aorist active. Some verbs like grapho have the first aorist active and also the second aorist passive. Others like lipo have second aorist active, but they have first aorist passive. So please, you just need to keep on checking words that are strange to you so that you know what exactly this is. Now let's look at the paradigm. Apestalen, I was sent. Apestales, you were sent. Apestale, he was sent. Apestalmen, we were sent. Apestalete, you were sent. Apestalesan, they were sent. We'll start with the Then the future passive indicative is based on the aorist passive stem. Now that is why we did not study the future passive when the future tense was studied, because it is actually based on the aorist passive stem. So as a primary tense, it will not take augment. It will also take future tense suffix sigma, and it will use a connecting vowel omicron or epsilon. Indicative verb. What luo looks like, it becomes lutesomai. I shall be loosed. Lutese, you will be loosed. Lutesetai, he will be loosed. Lutesometa, we shall be loosed. Luteseste, you will be loosed. Lutesontai, they will be loosed. And note that the deponent verbs vary in the aorist and in the future. Note that the passive forms like apokrinomai. In the aorist passive, it is written as apekrithen, I answered. Now, there are some verbs that have both passive and middle forms in the aorist, and this example is ginomai. It can appear as a genotmen and it can appear as a genethen. Both will be translated I became. Now to your concluding activity, choose stem verbs. Maybe it's the verbs that you wrote in the future. Write them in the aorist active and in the aorist passive. This is where I'm going to drop the class for now. See you at the next lesson. That will be. Looking at almost every aspect of verb under the indicative mood, beginning from the present and active indicative verbs to the passive, to the middle, to the imperfect, and even to the future aorist, but we will need to break it into two, and this we will do very soon. I am Olubi Adewale, your facilitator for this session. and I welcome you into this session on Greek verbs. Let's go.